please.
Super. I will make sure to do that then. All right, so let me share my PowerPoint here. All right, so we are going to be looking at the Revolutionary War today. And as John Green said in the video that you guys watched on Tuesday, the American Revolution is bigger than the American Revolutionary War. It kind of consists of the run-up to the Revolutionary War, the war itself, and then the attempts to craft a new government. We're going to be looking at a failed attempt in Lecture 8, that would be the Articles of Confederation government, and then we're going to be looking at the Constitution written starting in 1787 that turned out to be what we went with. But all of that time period you could consider to be part of the American Revolution because you needed to set up a new kind of government for there to be a revolution. So today's lecture is going to talk about the way that the Revolutionary War was really a global war. It was part of Britain's larger world historical struggle in the 18th century with France. The two countries went to war 4 times over the course of the 18th and early 19th century. And so really, we would never have been able to achieve our own independence as a country had it not been for France. And we would not have been able to get France involved had they not been part of a larger struggle with Britain. Okay, so it just worked out that our interests were aligned there. Here we see a picture of some war reenactors. You know, people reenact all kinds of different wars. I'm sure you've heard of Civil War reenactors, but these are Revolutionary War reenactors. What side are they reenacting here?
Great Britain.
That's right, because you see the British flag. Now, what do you notice about their uniforms?
The red coats.
Right. They are red coats. Anything else?
Very elegant, professional.
Yeah, they clearly have got commercially produced uniforms that are all quote unquote uniform. They're not wearing whatever it is that they could come up with out of their home closet. Something that has always kind of made me giggle about their uniforms, you'll notice the ammunition boxes cross over the chest and the back, making an X. So it's kind of like a target, shoot here. Anyway, so
They
those
also,
are, go ahead.
They also represent that their flag, because, you know, their flag kind of looks like an X. They're white.
Mm-hmm.
And the red is representing, and I think the blue will be their hats, I believe.
Yeah, very good. Now here are the American troops, or some of them, dressed in blue. Okay, so we're going to pick up where we left off with the last lecture on Tuesday, talking about the Continental Congress. The first Continental Congress was called in September of 1774 for Philadelphia. And at that point, this was really the first time that the colonies, all except for Georgia, as you will recall from the video, got together to plan as a unit. During the French and Indian War, there had been a proposal by Benjamin Franklin for a sort of united defense that was called the Albany Plan of Union. And if you've ever seen a cartoon of like a snake that's chopped into pieces and each piece of the snake is labeled with a different colony, that was a cartoon of the Albany Plan of Union. It never actually did end up coming to fruition, but the idea that the colonists might need to get together in their own defense had been percolating around for a while. The Continental Congress, the first one, encouraged states to form committees of observation and safety. And these were going to be fast, agile governing committees that would make it possible for the colonies to respond to anything that the British did. The men of the Congress were also in favor of coercing Britain into compliance through boycotts, using the economic weapon. And at the same time, the Boston Committee of Observation and Safety formed a militia. And these militiamen, or Minutemen as they were called, because they were supposed to be ready to fight in a moment's notice, started to, especially in Boston, conflict with General Thomas Gage, who was the royal governor sent to Massachusetts to replace Hutchinson, the governor who had been there for the Tea Party. Gage was concerned about the extent to which these militias were stockpiling weapons and ammunition, and he requested reinforcements from England. Now, I should say, you know, belonging to a militia in this time period was not an unusual thing. People were supposed to arm and drill for several days during the course of a year. The different towns and cities made that a rule for all free men over the age of 21. But this seemed a little different because the tension was getting high between the British troops and these individuals living in America. So on April 18th, 1775, Gage, the British general, had gotten wind of the fact that there was a large accrual of ammunition and weapons in Concord, Massachusetts. And Gage ordered his troops to march inland and to raid that ammunition dump and to take the ammunition. The Boston Committee of Observation and Safety understood that they needed to warn people that this was going to happen, and so they chose two guys, Paul Revere, a silversmith, and William Dawes, who nobody ever remembers because he was not part of the poem, you know, "Listen, my children, and you will hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere." The two of them galloped off to tell people that the British were coming. The next morning, the householders of Concord and nearby Lexington had been told that the British were about to arrive, so 70 of them assembled on Lexington Green. They were met by the British troops. They were told to disperse. The Americans were starting to back up, but somebody fired a shot, after which the British fired and killed 8 Americans and wounded another 10. Other communities saw smoke rising from Lexington and Concord and thought the British were burning the towns. And so as troops marched back to Boston, they were fired upon by Americans from inside their homes. By nightfall, the British had killed or wounded 93 Americans, but the Americans in turn had killed or wounded over 250 British soldiers. So it would be as though the, law enforcement of the time were attacked by people taking pot shots at them as they attempted to get back to their home base. The willingness of ordinary people to intervene to protect their homes and communities would really bother the British throughout the war. They had no idea that they were so disliked. They just really had no idea that they didn't have the hearts and minds of the American people. So Lexington and Concord, the first real battle of the Revolutionary War, happened before independence had been declared. Questions so far?
Yeah, were the militia, were they conscripted or was this volunteer?
They were all volunteers. What's going to happen slightly later when the Continental Army gets formed is that towns will have to come up with their own quota of men, and they do this in an interesting way that I will get to when we get to that page of the lecture. But at this point, it's all volunteer. They don't have any shortage of volunteers. from the perspective of the Americans of the time, you know, the British were doing a lousy job protecting them. So they were quite willing to take up arms.
That's where we have the Second Amendment.
Yeah, the thing about people being able to possess arms, that sort of right goes all the way back to the Declaration of Rights of 1688, which in Britain, which said that Protestants should have the right to be armed for the purpose of belonging to militias. And at that point, standing armies were considered to be a real threat to freedom in any state. So no state that wasn't like an authoritarian state was going to have a standing army. Over the course of the 18th century, the British amassed a pretty big standing army because they were constantly fighting against the French. But the presence of troops in America was really, really something that aggrieved the Americans, especially the quartering of troops in American homes. So the sort of well-organized, well-disciplined militia, that Amendment 2 goes along with Amendment 3, which is the one that prohibits quartering of troops.
Well-regulated militia.
Well-regulated, thank you, yes. All right. Other questions, comments? So at the same time that Lexington and Concord was going on, you know, Congress decided to meet again. They elected a Second Continental Congress that started to meet in Philadelphia in May of 1775. Now, few representatives to this body were loyalists or people who wanted to, you know, really suck up to the British monarchy, but the ones that were in the Second Continental Congress kind of wanted to make sure that they had given the king one more chance. So the Olive Branch Petition, which was generated by or authored by John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, a Quaker, professed continued loyalty to George III, who was the king at the time, and requested reconciliation. However, at the same time, this same Second Continental Congress issued the Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms. So on the one hand, they were saying, you know, if you don't treat us like slaves, then we will reconcile with you if you, you know, give in to our demands. But if you do treat us like slaves, we are going to take up arms. So it was like a carrot and a stick simultaneously. I should say very often the sort of language of slavery was used in the 18th century by white people to express their great indignation about how the government was treating them. And that's sort of like a two-edged sword. They were not, many of them were not opposed to slavery when it was African Americans who were enslaved, but they thought that the slavery of free white British people was, the metaphorical slavery of free white British people was extremely problematic. Okay, so on June 17th, 1775, there was another battle. This was a battle that took place in Charlestown. Now, Charlestown is a little bit of a rise above the Boston harbor, and Gage had a lot of ships in the harbor that had brought troops in. So the Americans had the high ground over these ships in the harbor, and Gage was kind of worried about this. He attacked them at Breed's Hill. Breed's Hill is not Bunker Hill, but the battle became called the Battle of Bunker Hill. Who knows why? I mean, Bunker Hill's next to it. But you can see right in the middle of that slide, there's Breed's Hill. The Americans were outgunned and outmanned, but they were at the top of the hill. So, you know, they were in a good place, defensively speaking. They were behind a hastily constructed fortification. They didn't have enough ammunition. So their commander said, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." In other words, until the British were 15 to 20 paces away. And this turned out to be a pretty effective strategy. The casualties were so enormous after the American shot that the British retreated in panic. And the British had to assault 2 more times before the American rebels finally ran out of ammunition and were ousted with bayonets. 400 Americans were killed at the Battle of Bunker Hill, but they had created over 1,000 British casualties.
Professor,
Questions?
is it true that the battle of Breeze Hill and Bunker Hill, when they ran out of bullets, they used rocks or anything that they could find on around them?
Yes, yes.
I thought it was just like a myth or something, but no. Yeah.
No, and that wouldn't have been the only time that people used rocks instead of, actual ammunition in a battle. I teach the British Empire, and there was another battle that took place in a British outpost of India, and the group that the British were fighting against were loading up cannon with rocks and whatever they can find. And these rocks, although not super aerodynamic, were highly effective at injuring structures and wounding people. Other questions? Okay. Well, we still haven't declared independence yet, even though the British are attacking their own people. And what it took for that to happen was really galvanizing public opinion through a document that set out the argument for declaring independence very, very clearly. Thomas Paine, who was an English immigrant, wrote the short book or long pamphlet, Common Sense. It was published in January 1776. And it suggested to many Americans, being written in a language that everybody could understand, that the British had, first of all, broken whatever social contract they had with their American colonists. That if the British king was in kind of like a paternal relationship with the Americans, it was supposed to be protecting them, he was doing a terrible job, that Americans were being killed by troops, they were having their houses set on fire. All right, so one of his arguments was this, that, the king was doing a bad job. Another argument of common sense was that as a continent kind of separated from Europe by an ocean, the Americans didn't need the British for anything. They were in a sort of natural defense position as regards countries that had navies. All right, so they're far away and they're protected by their ocean, but they also had all the natural resources that they could ever want and were well placed for trading with other countries besides Britain. Paine really attacked monarchy. He thought there was nothing good or special about a king. He didn't believe that kings were sort of chosen by God to rule over the people. But instead, he was an advocate of social contract theory, which is that everyone ought to be able to opt in to their own governance. You couldn't govern without the consent of the people. And that when a governing system was no longer providing the people with protection or was no longer fulfilling the reasons that people form a government to begin with, it was time to break those bonds and create a new government. So Thomas Paine's book sold like 150,000 copies in 6 months. It was extremely widely read, and it really did increase the discourse, the degree to which people were talking about independence as a good option. Okay. Questions about common sense? Paine is such an interesting guy, you know, parenthetically. He was a failure when he was in Britain. He was kind of a business failure. He started off as a corset maker, did not do a good job or did not succeed in that field. So he migrated to British North America, became this really skilled propagandist, then went over to France. He was there during the French Revolution, and he was instrumental in creating pro-revolutionary propaganda for the French Revolution. But then he pissed everybody off by confessing that he was more or less an atheist and lost a lot of people's support. So when he died, he had very few people at his funeral because the anti-Christian aspects of his belief system were a bridge too far for most people. Okay.
Is this a common is this a common method for vitalizing a movement? Like, it's definitely not something I see very often today, other than through, I guess, memes and clips of videos. But you know, this whole one document, one thing that everybody can get behind that starts convincing everybody to finally tip over into the other idea. Like, is this a common thing, or did it just happen to change the country this one time?
Anna, that is a fantastic question, and I'm going to say that up until the development of the internet, you really couldn't have an effective social movement without this galvanizing writing in some way. So, for example, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen in France, there was a manifesto, I forget what it was called, for the Students for a Democratic Society in the 1960s. The Civil Rights Movement had a letter from a Birmingham jail by Martin Luther King Jr. It seems like all the big social, Mein Kampf, I mean, I don't know that you want to call the Nazis a social movement, but when you try to get everybody on the same page about major change, then having a manifesto of some kind is really effective. One of the issues why, you know, Occupy Wall Street in 2011, in retrospect, was thought to have fallen apart was that there was no central manifesto of demands or explanation of what kind of government people wanted to see. And the internet, I think, has really led to more fragmentation of people's ideas and the inability of people to kind of get it together in terms of putting ideas into a form that everybody can read. So you'd be hard pressed to find a social movement that didn't have some kind of a manifesto.
So what you're saying is, like, maybe the internet has dampened our ability to do that. Like, do you think maybe the ability for so much information to get around, especially conflicting ideas, like, has that hindered our ability to do this again? Is that why we're so split these days? Or it's not the reason, but is that one of the reasons we're so split these days?
I think that is one of the reasons, although well, there's a couple things. If you look at how many books get published that are talking about, oh, well, here's what we need to do to fix America, here's what we do to fix America, there may be no shortage of actual words being produced, but there may be a shortage of, like, focus of attention on the words. And so we could have too many choices of people setting out ideas about what ought to be different. But if you look before the Civil War, there was also that same kind of major division and no one piece of literature that was going to pull both sides together. There were pieces of literature, though, that galvanized a side. So Uncle Tom's Cabin is often pointed to as the book that started the Civil War, because everybody read it and then, you know, said, oh my God, slavery is awful. So it did galvanize some of the abolitionists. But yeah, I do think the internet has decreased people's attention spans, focus. Who reads books? You know, that's part of it too. Good question. All right, any other questions? All right, so Paine writes Common Sense, and then the Second Continental Congress decided to put together a committee of 5 guys to write a Declaration of Independence. And this Declaration of Independence was going to list the grievances that the Americans had against the king. The 5 guys who collaborated on this were John Adams of Massachusetts, Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, Robert Livingston of New York, and Thomas Jefferson of Virginia. If you've ever watched the musical 1776, they sing a song about, oh, Adams, you should write it. No, Franklin, you should write it. And they finally end up with Jefferson actually writing it, and in real life, he did write it. The Declaration of Independence does 2 different things. First of all, it declares independence by virtue of the words in it. So it is a document that actually does an action. It is the document that actually declares the independence. But it also explains why. It was composed of a declaration of principles, followed by a long list of grievances that the authors of the document pinned on King George. They wanted to make sure that the vast majority of the British people understood that Parliament was not being blamed per se, that they didn't have a problem with the governance by everyone of British North America, but really they were trying to focus on the king and his ministers. I don't know if you guys know much about King George III, but he had some biological problems that caused him to have episodes of insanity that got worse as his life went on. So he was kind of a problematic individual in terms of governance to begin with, but he was also very, very firmly convinced that he was right and that the colonists were incorrect about the right form of governance. Okay, so the Declaration starts off like this. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. What does inalienable mean?
Got like kind of like God-given rights.
Yeah, they're God-given rights, but also you can't give them away. Inalienable means you can't alienate them from yourself. You can't give away your freedom. That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay, we understand what life is. We understand what liberty is. What is the pursuit of happiness?
Like kind of the opportunity to make what you can out of your own life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's purposely vague, but yeah, I would read it that way. Why do you suppose they didn't say, for example, in the older formulation, life, liberty, and property?
Because I think they didn't do that because they knew most people couldn't afford property back then. Mm-hmm. And the life to have a happy life, it doesn't necessarily mean to own property, but to do what makes whatever person happy.
Good. Yeah, they really didn't want people saying, where's my property? You need to give me property. So the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. All right, so everybody has to consent to be governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and institute a new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. All right, so when government stops protecting your life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, you have the right to alter or abolish that government. This is called the social contract theory. It has its roots in some late 17th century British thinkers like John Locke. The idea that all men are created equal was, first of all, a great departure from what people really believed at the time. The British didn't believe that the king and the aristocracy and the, I don't know, the chimney sweeper were created equal, but the Americans professed that they were. However, at the same time they were emphasizing equality and liberty, of course, the Americans had slavery. So that was something that really rings alarm bells to us looking back. But at the time, I don't know, at the time they almost didn't really believe their profession that all men were created equal, but that's what they said.
May I interject again? Sorry.
Yes, of course.
So I come from an interesting family, and they have views that I wouldn't suggest anybody be around them because of. But we do get into these discussions, and I like to quote the you told us that, I can't remember it because I'm half awake right now. Sorry, I just woke up in class, but it's like that we declared that all men were created equal. And it was interesting because my father's reaction, he says, I don't think it was about all men being created equal. I think it was about how they chose the king, how they chose the ruler. And it's like there's nothing special about the king itself. And so it was like, I guess maybe that was part of the perspective of like how they got away with saying that without practicing it. It's like, there's nothing special about your ruler. Like every man is subject to the same criticisms, the same, the same issues, not so much the same rights.
I quite like that formulation. It seems like it explains a lot about how it was that they could coexist, or they could, they could live with for themselves saying all men are created equal and then having slavery. I will say this, what historians say to kind of excuse that in the long run is, well, whatever they actually believed at the time, the language of the Declaration of Independence was subsequently used by social movements, including African American social movements and women and other groups, to gain full citizenship, to say, oh, well, back in the Declaration, you said all men were created equal, so how is it that you're excluding us? But what you say makes a lot of sense in terms of, okay, so if all men are created equal, we don't have an aristocracy, we don't have a monarchy.
Which gives them that argument that says, well, the people who wrote that already had slaves, so clearly that's not what they meant. And so kind of saying like, oh, fine, you can use it, but I believe in what they believed so many hundred years ago. And so that's funny, that's terrifying, but
yeah, that's problematic. And I have even seen the argument made lately that people who are, let's say, recipients of public benefits in some way should be excluded from being able to vote, which was a thing that was the case in the very early years of the early republic and has long been a thing of the past. But, some people make those arguments too. That's sort of like the problem with constitutional originalism, is that people didn't act as though all men were created equal in the early days of the republic. Okay. Other questions, comments?
I just wanted to add a comment. I believe
Sure.
that they chose men and they didn't say like specifically because they were hoping in the future times will change and it can mean everybody. Because if I remember right, I believe that when they referred to men, they were referring more to like the rich who owned land, property, and not just the common man who was sometimes poor, who was didn't own a lot of property to be considered, especially during the early republic. I remember that they couldn't vote, not anybody could vote. So I believe they went a little bit vague, believing that in the future, when the time is right, they would expand, you can say. So it will be for everybody and not just for a certain amount of people. So they didn't. I believe that the Constitution was very kind of vague in some sense. So later on, it can be improved on, just due to its times. And I remember Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, when they were writing the Declaration of Independence, that they wanted to add freedom to slavery, or yeah, it was, I think it's the Constitution to be exact. They wanted to free slavery, but at that time they needed the South's cooperation to be free, so they struggled to really pass it. But Thomas Jefferson wanted freedom for the slaves, but at that time it was just a different ideology that needed to be changed later on in the future. And that moment, they just needed to be free from England.
Yeah, he called for an end to slavery in the document originally, and it was decided by the committee that should be crossed out. But Jefferson is such an interesting figure because, on the one hand, you know, he had people that he enslaved at Monticello at his family farm, and those enslaved people grew all the food there and built his house and rebuilt it because he changed his mind a million times. And he had a long-term relationship with one of the enslaved women on the plantation. I'm not going to comment on what kind of relationship it was, but I'm going to say that somebody who is enslaved cannot really consent to a relationship, but she bore 6 children to Thomas Jefferson, and he didn't actually free them. A few of them escaped and passed for white because they were very light-skinned people, but he did not free his long-term partner, Sally Hemings. So he was a guy who certainly was walking both sides of the line when it came to slavery. All right, so the Declaration of Independence was passed through the Second Continental Congress on July 2nd, 1776. And at the same time, states began to call constitutional conventions to write constitutions for themselves and to serve as wartime legislatures. So state constitutions happened before we had any kind of overarching federal constitution. And a constitution is any set of transcendent laws that kind of is above all other laws in a polity. The British don't have a constitution. To this day, there is no written constitution in Britain. Under the British parliamentary system, they refer to all of the bodies of past case law and documents like the Declaration of Rights and Magna Carta, which dates back to the 1200s. They call all of that stuff the British Constitution, but they don't actually have a constitution that supersedes all laws. So the Americans started to see that they wanted to have some kind of uber law that superseded all other kinds of law. Massachusetts called a constitutional convention in 1779, and they set the tone for electing a constitutional convention, that it shouldn't be the same people who are currently serving in the assembly, because it ought to be, you know, a vast representation of society. You're trying to get people to consent to be governed by creating a document that embodies this consent. So Massachusetts, for example, wrote its state constitution through a constitutional convention, and then it was ratified. And the process of ratification means that they went around to little town hall meetings and had people vote as to whether they liked the state constitution as is. And that way, everybody belonged to this new voluntary compact. As the Constitution of 1780 in Massachusetts declared, the body politic is formed by a voluntary association of individuals. It is a social compact by which the whole people covenants with each citizen, and each with the common people, that all shall be governed by certain laws for the common good. Women and children did not have to consent, nor did felons, people with mental disabilities, They were considered to all be subsumed under others who were better at making decisions, i.e. men. State constitutions drafted at this time had declarations of rights. They included such rights as the right to petition the government for redress of grievances. That is the right to get together, to assemble, and to present grievances to the government. Freedom of speech, trial by jury, freedom from self-incrimination in a court of law. Most of these state constitutions gave the largest amount of the power to the legislature of the state rather than to the governor, because Americans at this point were kind of turned off the idea of putting too much power in any one person's hands. Okay, so war has broken out in 1775. The Second Continental Congress has declared independence. The states are all like their own little countries, each of them with its own constitution, and then the war needs to be fought. So when you look at American society, about a third of the people living in the North American colonies were anti the British, wanted to be independent, wanted to fight, saw benefit coming if they broke away from the British. But a third of Americans were loyalists or Tories. They were pro-British. They benefited a lot from international trade. They included government officials, colonial merchants, some great planters, many working people. One of the most committed groups of British loyalists was African Americans. And this was because in 1775, one of the British military leaders, Lord Dunmore, proclaimed that if any African Americans, if any enslaved people ran away and joined the British side, they would be promised their freedom at the end of the war. So way more Black Americans fought on the side of the British during the Revolutionary War than fought on the side of the Americans. One of the most famous loyalists in the American Revolutionary War was the former Continental Commander Benedict Arnold. Benedict Arnold was the commander of the American troops at West Point in upstate New York until September 1780. And Arnold was extremely important in the victory at Saratoga in 1778. But he was angry because George Washington reprimanded him and refused to sort of recognize his great wartime feats. And so he plotted to sell West Point to the British, but the Americans discovered the plot before he was able to do so, and Arnold switched sides and became a British commander. A third of the Americans were neither rebels nor loyalists. They were uncommitted and waiting to see what was going to happen. A lot of the loyalists during the course of the war fled to either Canada or Britain, and so the percentage that were loyalists decreased as the war continued. The largest issue, I was going to skip a part, sorry. Americans could be part of the militia or part of the army. The militia augmented the army, was kind of a civil defense. Its members really didn't have uniforms. They dressed in hunting shirts. They had muskets. The typical combat of the time was to line two masses of troops up against each other across a field, and then the troops would march towards each other, and then the first line of troops of each side would kind of kneel down, and then they would fire, and then the troops behind them would fire, and then everybody had to take time to reload, because muzzle loading muskets take a long time to reload. The militias in America preferred to take a strategy from the Native Americans and use hand-to-hand combat or to ambush. And at the time, the British considered this very unsporting, almost sort of like a war crime, in that people were not fighting fair if they ambushed. The Continental Army was the more formal fighting force. Recruits were raised by a carrot and a stick. The carrot was, we'll give you a bounty of $20 and we'll give you 100 acres of land if you enlist for 3 years or the duration of the conflict. But the stick was, the various towns were told, you need to supply X number of men for the army. And so they rounded up immigrants, convicts, young people who didn't actually have jobs and families yet, poor people, and kind of pressed them into service as that town's troops. Serving in the army thus was far from a prestigious profession on the American side. Desertion was really high. Supplies were scarce. Regiments were organized by state, but Washington, who was the commander of all the troops, could not get states to promise or actually follow through with their promises of providing soldiers. The total American force, fighting force, was about 300,000 people. But sometimes Washington only had like 1,000 guys, like over the winter of 1777. Another issue was funding the war. States were invited to make contributions to keep it going, but they were not required to do so. The Army raised supplies by trying to contract with farmers directly, but many farmers would prefer to deal with the British because they thought their money was more likely to keep value than the American paper money, continental dollars that they were being paid with. Okay, questions so far? This is a famous painting here. Anybody know the title of this painting?
Is it Crossing the Delaware?
Yes, it's Washington crossing the Delaware. So,
Christmas night, right? Or Christmas Eve?
yeah, I mean, in real life, he crossed the Delaware on Christmas Eve in order to surprise attack the mercenaries that the British had hired from the German Principality of Hesse. The British, you know, were not making themselves real popular with the Americans by hiring mercenaries to fight against them. And so, you know, that became kind of a problem for the British, but Washington had one of his few early in the war victories by attacking the Hessians when they were all super drunk. So 1776, 1776 and 7, George Washington was up against British General Howe, who headquartered himself in New York and prepared to wait out the winter. Washington headquartered himself in Morristown, New Jersey, and started to attack the British even in the depths of winter. So trying to take advantage of any advantage that he could. I mean, normally the troops would just hunker down for the winter. He scored a victory at Trenton by surprising the drunken Hessians in their beds on Christmas Day. But the winter was so cold. Yeah, exactly. So that was like the Battle of Trenton was like the one good outcome for the Continental troops. But there were only 1,000 Continental soldiers who managed to stick it out until the winter of 1777 was over. What ended up being a turning point in the war was the Battle of Saratoga. That was a victory for the Continental Army. What happened was a British general by the name of John Burgoyne was in charge of the British Northern armies, and he had been fighting in Canada and coming southward along what is now Vermont with 7,000 men and 30 carts with his personal goods. The roads in Vermont and in upstate New York were impassable, and the British were not making very much headway. They were having to cut down trees in order to actually move through the forest because there weren't any roads. The British took Fort Ticonderoga and they captured a lot of Continental supplies, But then it was so hard for them to move all of their stuff that they decided to stay there, and they were besieged by American troops. 6,000 British troops surrendered to American troops, the Continental Army led by Horatio Gates. The 6,000 British troops they couldn't really take them as prisoners of war. I mean, they had their weapons taken away from them, but then they were paroled because they didn't have anywhere to store these prisoners. And the Battle of Saratoga looked so good from an international perspective that it managed to get the French to decide to help us. Without France, Spain, and the Netherlands, the Americans would never have won the Revolutionary War. Once European nations saw the Battle of Saratoga as a victory, France, which had been funneling covert economic aid to the Americans since the beginning of the war, including most of the gunpowder was coming from France, they decided to sign a couple of treaties openly with the Americans in 1778. The first treaty, the Treaty of Amity and Commerce, was a trade treaty, and the second treaty was a military alliance. Now, Britain and France had long been enemies all throughout the 18th century. As I said, they had fought in several wars. And at this point, Spain and the Netherlands were both allies of France. So we had the foreign aid not just of the French, but also of the Spanish and the Dutch. And so it was very helpful for the Americans to have naval powers involved on their side, since we really didn't have a navy at this point. After 1778, the British went south, and you can see in the map on the bottom there the Southern campaign. So some of the troops went down to Georgia, South Carolina. They went by sea via the harbor areas, and they were trying to, take the South and hold on to it as a way of getting the Americans to surrender. But the problem was that every time they left and they couldn't leave troops in place, the Americans quickly reverted back to being in rebel control in the South. They didn't like the British. The British were committing some war crimes, or what we would consider to be war crimes. And so slowly the British in the Southern campaign were working their way north, but they were losing the territory that they had gained. In 1781, on the peninsula at Yorktown, George Washington worked with the French to fake out General Cornwallis. Washington pretended he was going somewhere else, but he came in to the peninsula from the west, just as the French Navy was coming in across from the east, and Cornwallis and his large British army were forced to surrender at the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. So Cornwallis sued for peace, and then there was a peace negotiation leading to the final peace treaty signed September 3rd, 1783. Interesting thing, the Americans, by their Treaty of Alliance, should have had to keep fighting until the French had gotten what they wanted from their war with the British, but the French kind of let the Americans conclude a peace with the British, because the Americans at this point were fairly tired fighting the most powerful country on the globe. By the peace treaty, Britain recognized the independence of the United States with a boundary in the west at the Mississippi River. The northern and southern boundaries were indistinct, and this would cause trouble later. One of the things that the British wanted that they were not able to get was for the Americans to give back land that they had confiscated from British loyalists during the war. But as we're going to see as we move forward in time to like the War of 1812, the British agreed to independence in the peace treaty, but then they didn't really act as though they had agreed to American independence. So they're going to hang around in our northwestern forts and supply Native Americans who are fighting against Anglo-Americans, supply those Native Americans with rifles or with guns and other weapons. So the war officially ends in 1783, but the British don't necessarily stop treating America like a colony. Okay, questions? All right, I know I said a lot of stuff there, but there is the Revolutionary War in global context. Remember how important it is for the French to be involved. I should also say that the Marquis de Lafayette was extremely important in helping to train some of the American troops. He becomes a real hero of the American Revolution, a real celebrity. So if you've ever seen Hamilton, the musical, a lot of that is taken from things that really happened. But I'm going to stop there for today, and we will continue on next week talking about the Articles of Confederation and then the Constitution. So I will hang around for a moment in case anybody has any questions, but if not, I will see you guys next week.
Thank you. Have a great weekend.
You too.
I actually did have a question for the assignment due tomorrow.
Sure.
You said that we could either type it in essay form or paragraph, right?
Right.
Like by paragraph, does that mean like we can like number it like question 1 and then write the answer?
Absolutely. Yes, you may do that.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
So I don't want to waste anybody else's time because I can't